Welcome to Fortune Forecast. I am Daisy, your hostess. In this video, we continue on with the Book of Life, and we're in part 4, titled The Book of Society. This book was written by Upton Sinclair, published in 1921 by the Payne Book Company out in Chicago. It is in the public domain. Are you new to my channel and you found me on this video and would like to catch up? Please go to my book playlist and you can grab all the other chapters before this one. Otherwise, if you're ready to get started, go to the description and hit the timestamp and you can move on with that. Or if you'd like to just sit here for a minute or so as I share my narrator's comment regarding the previous 2 chapters. Titled The Iron Ring and Foreign Markets. Well, I must say, it was an interesting analogy about the iron ring. Reminded me of the women of the KAYAN tribe. They wear these brass coils around their necks all their lives in order to lengthen them. And it's believed by that tribe that the longer the neck, the more beautiful the woman. It's really sad what these women go through. In an article by the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, there's a whole article about how these people are suffering because of these rings. Either they have to keep them so that they can bring money to and tourism to their community, and it appears, according to the article, that even the government exploits this particular tribe. From the iron ring analogy, it seems the way that the author described this capitalist situation with our products and surplus, I feel for the farmer and all those people that have produced things and then end up with surplus. And then as a taxpayer, I feel really bad for all of us, thinking that this system is obsolete. Talk about machinery or lower wages to get the same product. I mean, my parents, immigrants in America from the Dominican Republic, had a big factory with employees and they were all working really hard. And then in the 1980s, they had to shut down their factory because no longer could they pay the wages that were helping these people that were in their factory, because it was the whole business, the whole industry decided to pick up and leave to other countries where they could get cheap labor. And ever since then, my parents really struggled. It was really hard to see my father at age 60 out on the streets and worried about how he was going to pay his bills. And what's really sad is that my father did retire, but then didn't enjoy his retirement because shortly after his retirement, within a few years, he passed away, coming to America to live the American dream. Well, I am so grateful that my father came to America, that I was born here in this beautiful country, but I saw his struggle. And I see the struggle of so many people because I've been blessed to work in fields, whether it was as a deputy sheriff and watching what was happening at that level, the crime and the corruption, or as a housing counselor helping thousands of people that were in foreclosure to get back on track, or as a mayor and struggling to provide services while not raising taxes, understanding that there are people in need, and never forgetting that I too am a taxpayer, and battling with administration to keep remembering that people first and to make sure that the funds are being appropriated in the right place. I wasn't here for the panic of 1857, but I could tell you that I was here for the financial crash of 2008. And here we are, 2023. And people at their edge of their feet. Sometimes I look at the stock market and it's like, how could this stock be going up when we have all these when I'm reading layoffs from Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Google, 2 or 3 people, they're laying off people by the hundreds. And the markets go up? Interesting. Maybe you have answers. I'd love to hear your comment. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter. The Capitalist War. Shows how the competition for foreign markets leads nations automatically into war. In a discussion of the world's economic situation published in 1906, the writer portrayed the ruling class of Germany as sitting in front of a thermometer, watching the mercury rising and knowing that when it reached the top, the thermometer would break. This thermometer was the German class system of government, and the mercury was the socialist vote. In 1870, the vote was 30,000. In 1844, it was 549,000. In 1893, it was 1,876,000. In 1903, it was 3,008,000. In 1907, it was 3,250,000. In 1911, it was 4,250,000. Right in between 1906 and 1913. I again and again pointed out that this increase was the symptom of social discontent in Germany, caused by the overproduction of invested capital throughout the world and the intensification of the competition for world markets. I pointed out that a slight increase in the vote would be sufficient to transfer to the working class of Germany the political power of the German state. And I said that the ruling class of Germany would never permit that to happen. When it was ready to happen, Germany would go to war, to seize the trade privileges of some other nation. There was a time when wars were caused by national and racial hatreds. There are still enough of these venerable prejudices left in the world, but no student of the subject would deny the main source of modern wars is commercial rivalry. In 1917, we sent Eugene V. Debs to prison for declaring that the late World War was a war of capitalist greed. But 2 years later, President Wilson, who had waged the war, declared in a public speech that everybody knew it had been a war of commercial rivalries. The aim of modern war makers are two. First, capitalism must have raw materials, including coal and oil, the sources of power, and gold and silver, the basis of credit. Parts of the world which are so unfortunate as to be rich in these substances become the bone of contention between rival financial groups organized as nations. Some sarcastic writer has defined a backward nation as one which has gold mines and no navy. We are horrified to read of the wars of the French monarchs caused by the jealous quarrels of mistresses. But in 1905, we saw Russia and Japan go to war and waste 1 million lives because a certain Russian Grand Dukes had bribed certain Chinese mandarins and obtained concession of timber on the Yalu River. We now observe France and Germany vowed to undying hate because of iron mines in Lorraine and the efforts of France to take the coal mines of Silesia from Germany and give them to Poland, which is another name for French capitalism. The other end sought by the war makers is markets for manufactured products and control of trade routes, coaling stations, and cable necessary to the building of foreign trade. England has been mistress of the seas for some 300 years, which meant that her traders had obtained most of these advantages. But then came Germany, with her newly developed commercialism, shoving her rival out of the way. The Englishman was easygoing. He liked to play cricket and stop and drink tea every afternoon. But the German worked all day and part of the night. He trained himself as a specialist. He studied the needs of his customers, all of which to the Englishman was unfair competition. But here were the populations of the crowded slums, dependent for their weekly wage and their daily bread upon the ability of the factories to go on turning out products. Here was the ever-blackening shadow of unemployment, the mutterings of social discontent, the agitators on the soapboxes, the workers listening to them with more and more eager attention, and the journalists and politicians and bankers watching this phenomenon with a ghastly fear. So came the Great War. Social discontent was forgotten overnight, and England and France plunged in to down their hated rival once and for all. Now they have succeeded. Germany's ships have been taken from her, and likewise her cables and coaling stations. The Berlin-Baghdad Railroad is a forgotten dream. The British sit in Constantinople, and the traffic goes by sea. American capitalism wakes up and rubs its eyes after a debauch of Presbyterian idealism and discovers that it has paid out some $20 billion in order to confer all these privileges and advantages upon its rivals. Ever since I can remember the world, there have been peace societies. I look back in history and discover that ever since there have been wars, there have been prophets declaiming against them in the name of humanity and God. As I write, there's a great world conference on disarmament in session in Washington, and all good Americans hope that war is to be ended and permanent peace made safe. All that I can do at this juncture is to point out the fundamental and all-controlling fact of present-day economics, that for the ruling class of any country to agree to disarmament and the abolition of war is for that class to sign its own death warrant and cut its own throat. American capitalism can survive on this earth only by strangling and destroying Japanese capitalism and British capitalism, and doing it before long. The far-sighted capitalists on both sides knows that and are making their preparations accordingly. What the members of the peace societies and the diplomats of disarmament conferences do is to cut off the branches of the tree of war. They leave the roots untouched, and then, when the tree continues to thrive, they are astounded. I conclude this chapter with a concrete illustration cut from my morning newspaper. We went to war against German militarism and to make the world safe for democracy, meaning thereby capitalist commercialism. We commanded the German people to beat their swords into plowshares, that is, to set their Krupp factories to making tools of peace, and they did so. We saddled them with an enormous indemnity, making them our serfs for a generation or two, and compelling them to hasten out into the world markets, to sell their goods and raise gold to pay us. And now, how does their behavior strike us? Do we praise their industry and fidelity to their obligations? Here are the headline news of a news dispatch published by the Los Angeles Times on December 10, 1921, at the top of the front page, right-hand column, the most conspicuous position in the paper. Read it and understand the sources of modern war. New attack by Berlin, dumping goods by wholesale. Cheap German trash puts thousands of Americans out of employment. Glove plants shut down and potash industry killed by Teuton intrigue. End of chapter 50. We'll remain here in this video and head into chapter 51. Before I turn the page, take a second, hit that like button. The YouTube algorithm keeps me here in the YouTube universe. Thank you very much for that. Okay, now let's head over here to chapter 51, the possibilities of production. Shows how much wealth we could produce if we tried, and how we proved it when we had to. One of the commonest arguments in defense of the present business system runs as follows. The amount of money which is paid to labor is greatly in excess of the amount which is paid to capital. Suppose that tomorrow you were to abolish all dividends and profits and divide the money up among the wage workers. How much would each one get? The sum is figured for some big industry, and it is shown that each worker would get $100 or $200 additional per year. Obviously, this would not bring the millennium. It would hardly be worthwhile to take the risk of reducing production in order to gain so small a result. But now we are in a position to realize the fallacy of such an argument. The tax which capital levies upon labor is not the amount which capital takes for itself, but the amount which it prevents labor from producing. The real injury of the profit system is not that it pays so large a reward to a ruling class. It is the iron ring which it fastens about industry, barring the workers from access to the machinery of production except when the product can be sold for a profit. Labor pays an enormous reward to the businessman for his management of industry, but it would pay labor to reward the businessman even more highly if only he would take his goods in kind, and would permit labor, after this tax is paid, to go on making those things which labor itself so desperately needs. But you see, the businessman does not take his goods in kind. The owner of a great automobile factory may make for himself one automobile or a score of automobiles, but he quickly comes to a limit where he has no use for any more, and what he wants is to sell automobiles and make money. He does not permit his workers to make automobiles for themselves or for anyone else. He reserves the product of the factory for himself, and when he can no longer sell automobiles at a profit, he shuts the workers out and the automobile making comes to an end in that community. Thus it appears that the iron ring, which strangles the income of labor, strangles equally the income of capital. It paralyzes the whole social body and so limits production that we can form no conception of what prosperity might and ought to be. Consider the situation before the war. We were all of us at work under the competitive system, and with the exception of a few parasites, everybody was occupied pretty close to the limit of his energy. If anyone had said that it would be possible for our community to pitch in and double or treble our output, you would have laughed at him. But suddenly we found ourselves at war and in need of a great increase in output, and we resolved one and all to achieve this end. We did not waste any time in theoretical discussions about the rights of private capital or the dangers of bureaucracy and the destruction of initiative. Our government stepped in and took control. It took the railroads and systemized them. It took the big factories and told them exactly what to make. It took the raw materials and allotted them where they were needed. It fixed the prices of labor and ordered millions of men to this or that place, to this or that occupation. It even seized the foodstuffs and directed what people should eat. In 1,000 ways, it suppressed competition and replaced it by order and system. And what was the result? We took 5 million of our young men and the very cream of our industrial force and withdrew them from all productive activities. We put them into uniforms and put them through a training which meant that they were eating more food and wearing more clothing and consuming more goods than 9/10 of them had ever done in their lives before. We built camps for them and supplied them with all kinds of costly products of labor, such as guns and cartridges, automobiles, and airplanes. We treated 2 million of them to an expensive trip to Europe, and there we set them to work, burning up and destroying the products of industry to the value of many billions of dollars. And not only did we supply our own armies, we supplied the armies of all our allies. We built millions of dollars worth of ships, and we sent over to Europe, whether by private business or by government loans, some $10 billion worth of goods, more than 10 years of our exports before the war. All the labor necessary to produce all this wealth had to be withdrawn from industry, so far as concerned our domestic uses and needs. It should not be too much to say that from domestic industry we withdrew a total of 10 million of our most capable labor force. I think it would be reasonable to say that 2/3 of our productive energies went to war purposes and only 1/3 was available for home use. And yet, we did it without a particle of real suffering. Many of us worked hard, but a few of us worked harder than usual. Most of us got along with less wheat and sugar, but nobody starved. Nobody really suffered ill health, and our poor made higher wages and had better food than ever in their lives before. If this argument is sound, it proves that our productive machinery is capable, when properly organized and directed, of producing 3 times the common necessities of our population. Assuming that our average working day is 9 hours, we could produce what we at present consume by 3 hours of intelligent directed work per day. Let us look at the matter from another angle. Just present, the hero of the American businessman is Herbert Hoover. And Mr. Hoover recently appointed a committee not of socialists and utopians, but of engineering experts to make a study of American productive methods. The report showed that American industry was only 35 or 40% efficient. Incidentally, this committee on waste assessed, in the case of the building industry, 65% of the blame against management and only 21% against labor. In 6 fundamental industries, it assessed 50% of the blame against management and less than 25% against labor. 15 years ago, a professor of engineering, Sidney A. Reeve by name, made an elaborate study of the wastes involved in our haphazard and planless industrial methods and embodied his findings in a book, The Cost of Competition. His conclusion was that of the total amount of energy expended in America, more than 70% was wasted. We were doing 100% of work and getting 30% of results. If we would get 100% of results, we should produce 3 and 100 times as much wealth, and the income of our workers would be increased to $1,000 or $2,000 a year. Robert Blatchford, in his book Merry England, has a saying to the effect that it makes all the difference when half a dozen men go out to catch a horse, whether they spend their time catching the horse or keeping one another from catching the horse. Our next task will be to point out a few of the ways in which good, honest American businessmen and working men, laboring as intelligently and conscientiously as they know how, waste their energies in keeping one another from producing goods. End of chapter 51. All right, let's move on to the next chapter. Take a minute and hit that like button. If you like what you see on this channel, subscribe and share it with your friends. Head over to the next video. Well, I will be there with the cost of competition.